So thank you very much indeed, Trina, and very succinctly summarised a very complex but very interesting and important area. So I'll invite our third panel to join us here, if I could, please. It's a great pleasure to welcome Ryan Meade, who is Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager at Google. We have Fiona Jennings, who is Head of Policy and Public Affairs with the ISPCC. And we have Eoin Whelan, who is Professor of Business Analytics and Society here in the University of Galway. So as for this morning, I'm going to invite each of them to say a few words over a couple of minutes to give their initial reflections, and we'll take the discussion from there. So I might start with you, Fiona.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fergal. Hello, everybody. So I suppose I'm going to frame my reflection maybe on that process that Trina outlined, maybe looking at the strengths of it and the weaknesses or perceived weaknesses, maybe if I frame them that way. And then maybe look into the future as well. So I suppose I've worked in this area as well, alongside Trina to some extent as well for the last, I suppose since like 2015, 2016. And I suppose that's the one thing that I would like to say as well, is that, change was never going to happen overnight, because I suppose, what we were trying, or what, government was trying to do was to unravel, I suppose, 2, almost 3 decades of a state of affairs that really had no kind of regulation or no oversight whatsoever. But just in terms, I suppose, of the strengths of the process, that as I see them, and communication was something that came up a lot earlier on as well today in the other 2 case studies. And I think that it was the communication that we had and the communication that was allowed as well, or the environment that was created. Because I suppose when I did start out working in this area, and you were trying to talk to different government departments about children's online safety, it was very difficult to land it anywhere. You were bounced from one department to another. There wasn't really any ownership of the issue. But I suppose, as Trina mentioned, there was the Law Reform Commission report. I certainly think that was a catalyst in 2016. And then we had, I suppose, for me anyways, was a very memorable Oireachtas Commission meeting when you had 4 ministers present from Children, Justice, Education. I think he's not here now, Richard Bruton, and Justice. And that really, I think for a lot of us working in the space, that was a real demonstrable show of there was intent, there was purpose here to tackle this. And I think that engagement probably continued throughout as well, which was really good. And there was a lot of different varieties of the types of engagement as well. So whether it was that, one-to-one with the department, the open policy debate, and you touched on it, Trina, I think was really, really important, because what that did was it brought all those diverse stakeholders into the one room, who perhaps ordinarily would not have been together. And that was important because, me as working for an NGO, representing children's interests, I have, they have certain needs and requirements, Ryan here as well, working for a platform, they've got certain needs and requirements as well. And they're all valid, but they're all complex as well. But I also think as well, a strength of the implementation process was that, once the OSMR was enacted, it was not long after that we had Comisiún na Meade in place as well. So the regulator was up, it was running. I think they were even doing pre-work before they officially started. So that was really good. And I suppose that communication has continued as well. And I can imagine sometimes that it does feel tough, on people working in the space, and when they do open the papers and how that hits sometimes. But I suppose there has to be an acknowledgement that, policy development, legislative change and reform, it does take time, because, worse than no policy at all is a policy that is absolutely unenforceable. That doesn't serve anybody. I suppose just in terms of even perceived weaknesses maybe of the process, there was so many different interest groups, and I suppose trying to sometimes, shift through the noise, and even in our own sector, trying to get a concerted message across to everybody was challenging at times as well. And sometimes as well, maybe flawed assumptions of, do we really understand the problem that we're trying to solve? And I'd say to some extent, we're probably still in that space a little bit. But again, that comes back to the ever evolving nature and the speed as well of the environment that we're working in. And I suppose just looking forward then quickly, just to finish up, I loved earlier on, I can't remember who said it, but they were saying about your challenge team, get your challenge team together in the room. And, you know, and I really hope that, and I know it is, because you have the youth forum next week, and I know we're part of helping organise that as well. And to have children and young people as part of your challenge team, and to listen to them and to understand, I suppose, their perspectives, but also as well to recognise their rights as well. So strengths as well.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, Fiona. I'll come to Ryan next.
Okay, thanks, Fergal, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk about this topic. Like Fiona, I was involved or engaged with Trina and her department throughout the process, and a super interesting case study of policy development, including I was a member of the Online Safety Advisory Council, which I didn't see mentioned on the slide there, Trina.
Couldn't fit it
in. But that was a cross-sectoral group which met in the run-up to this whole policy development, which I feel was very effective. I mean, I probably said it in the room there. Some people talk down about talking shops. I'm actually a huge fan of a good talking shop. I think it's, you know, what is the Parliament other than a talking shop? That's what the word means. So I think it's always good to talk. But I think that it does have a real policy impact. I think that came through on your presentation. So I don't want to say too much about the case study because I think it was covered very comprehensively. But I think just want to pick up on Trina's last sort of point about where do we go from here and looking forward. And I think what's clear, and I think you used the word momentum, there is political momentum now behind a particular proposal. We see sort of legislation popping up in different EU member states and a process at EU level to look at a digital age majority, social media ban, age limits, whatever you want to call it. But what it is really is a kind of a blanket service level ban for particular ages on a particular set of services. And I think, you know, I think most people are in these rooms are not in favour of that approach, but you can't deny the momentum. So I suppose the question we need to look at is how do you channel that momentum into something that may deliver for young people online, in particular allow them to enjoy the benefits of technology and being online while having the risks mitigated. So in Google we use the term protecting young people in the digital world, not from the digital world. And the question in my mind is how do we harness the momentum? Because I think there is a danger at the moment that the political direction will go towards spending a lot of energy on coming up with a solution that nobody's asking for effectively, and that won't be effective. But on the other hand, and I think we've heard it today in the different case studies, you simply can't ignore politics, you can't ignore the political demands that are there. So the question really is how do you make use of it? I don't have an answer, and you'd be surprised to hear, but I do just want to offer a couple of thoughts on how we should think about that. I think the first thing to say is that the EU level is probably the key sort of venue for this discussion. I think that there are bills proposed in different member states, but I don't think anyone would say that 27 different standards across the single market would deliver a lot of benefit for young people and certainly be difficult to implement. And the other key point there is that actually it limits room for manoeuvre quite significantly because, as Trina said, the DSA already harmonises a lot of the kind of enforcement mechanisms and so on. So in a sense, the DSA means that the only thing a member state can do is a kind of a fairly blunt ban. But I think there is now work happening at EU level, so I think that's probably the direction it's going. The other thing I would say, though, is to redirect towards a focus on the specific features that cause concern for parents and for young people. I think the problem with a service level ban is that there's no kind of, it's not answering any particular question, it's just saying stop. Whereas I think Fiona, academics, experts have been looking in detail, and we've been looking on our side in Google into, well, what are the appropriate restrictions for young people online that create age-appropriate experiences? So, for example, we don't do personalised advertising for under 18, we don't allow direct messaging on YouTube for under 18, these sort of restrictions. And, I'm not saying we have the perfect set of restrictions, but I think that's a good focus for policymakers to consider what are that set of restrictions. I'm probably going on a bit too long, so I'll just mention my final couple of points. The other thing I'd say is existing laws are there and should be used. I think if there is a problem with enforcement of laws, the answer can never be let's have a new law and try and enforce that as well. So things like DSA, AVMS are in place. Enforcement is happening, maybe not at the pace people might expect, but I think there really does need to be investment in seeing that through. And then it's already been mentioned, but engaging young people is absolutely crucial. I mentioned a couple of examples. We've worked with WebWise as well quite a bit. And I think, you know, you don't want to put the problem on the young people and say, you tell us what to do. But I think even just having young people engaged in the conversation keeps the grown-ups honest. It's very important. And then
some of the best consultations, in fact, we're likely to have had in any of my spheres that I've been involved in and elsewhere have been with young people, children and young people.
Absolutely.
Who really
and as we've heard today, it is happening across a number of scores. So sorry, I probably got on a bit too long, but final point is just about the need to not just have evidence-based policy, but to actually find ways to present the evidence to the political layer in an effective way, because as I think Trina said, you know, different governments have their own evidence base. I mean, you know.
and Trina talked about socialising the issue again once you moved.
So I think that's another important focus. So sorry, I recognise I probably got on a bit long.
No, that's great. Thank you very much indeed, Ryan. And then Eoin, your research explores the psychology underlying engagement with the interactive digital media. So do you want to say something in that space?
Yeah, thanks, Fergal. Good afternoon. So I'm the researcher on the panel. So I've been researching social media for about 20 years now. My PhD started off on that topic. It was called social software back in the day. So part of the problem of coming up with policy that helps us mitigate these harms is that social media is changing so quickly. So what social media is today is very different than what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So if we do research and come up with evidence today, you know, in 2 years' time, the technology is very much different. So acknowledge the difficulties that Trina and her team have in coming up with policy in this area, just because it's moving so fast. I want to make the point as well that kind of related to that is that the world young people live in today is very different than my generation, your generation, whatever generation you might be. We've created a society that's very structured nowadays, that we drop kids to school, we collect them from school, we bring them to after school activities, they're under pressure to do well in their exams. And part of my research around talking to teenagers, and it's great to hear one of the common themes here is having young people involved in these discussions. And when we actually talk to them, what they say is that, yeah, social media and online platforms are important to them, but they'd love to spend more time just hanging out with their friends. And I remember one story that a young girl told us, that she met up with her friends in a shopping centre and she felt like a delinquent, that a security guard was hovering around, that when young people, which is part of their social development, just meeting up and hanging out and bouncing off each other, making mistakes and all those faux pas, that's part of being a teenager. But that happens less now, just the way society has gone, and in a lot of cases, online platforms and social media is the default to get that social interaction. So in terms of the policy side of things, so it's great we have Ryan from the online platform as part of this panel, and they have a very important role to play in policy. So your business model is about engaging people, and that's absolutely fine, but at what point does this become a risk, and to who does that become a risk? So at that point, that's where we need to start thinking about, well, what tools or policy or regulations can we come up with to keep those people safe? So being the researcher, I'm supposed to be here saying this is exactly what the evidence says, research evidence, but we don't have that. It's a complete minefield, as Trina already alluded to, that there is no clear consensus about the role of the impact of social media on teenagers or young people's and their mental health and well-being. At best, there's a very weak link. But there's no such thing as an average adolescent or a teenager. Within that, there are certain cohorts of teenagers that might be more disadvantaged than others. So we need to try and identify who those are, why are they struggling online more than others, and what can we do about it? So, for example, we've done a piece of research where we found that a certain cohort of teenage boys, the more time they spend on social media, the angrier they get. They have more anger management problems. And that's not to say that social media is causing the problems. What we think is happening is that they already have anger issues to begin with. Maybe their home, their family life is not great. They're not doing well in school. So when they go online, go on social media, they look for content that's going to make them feel better. And in a lot of cases, that is looking at other people's lives who might be struggling. And the algorithms pick up on this and start feeding more of that content back to them, so it might actually amplify some of the anger management issues. So we mentioned the Oireachtas committee recently talked about recommender systems and maybe regulating those. So we never have perfect evidence about what drives policy here, but I think we have to get to a point of where there's minimal viable evidence. So I think around certain features, there might be minimal viable evidence that something needs to be done to control these features, or even there's a whole movement about rights by design. Maybe they should be turned off by default, kind of reverse to the auto-enrollment for in pensions, do the opposite, turn them off by default, and make that friction, that tension there, that someone, if you really do want to go and have auto-scroll or recommendation algorithms, that you have to go to the effort to turn those on. And that could be a useful thing to think about as well. One or two other points. We think we can learn a lot from Australia's experience. So they were first out of the blocks to implement social media restrictions. I think John gave a good quote this morning that a wise man learns from the mistakes of others. So we could have a whole session and talking about the Australia social media ban. But one thing I don't think they really thought about were something that we call compensatory behaviours. So if we remove teenagers from social media or restrict the amount of time, well, what are they going to do with that time, free time that they have? Do we think that they're going to start taking up activities and hobbies and doing other activities that are going to promote their well-being? I don't think they really thought about that. And there's some emerging evidence from Australia that they're actually spending more time watching TV or playing video games. So it's kind of an unintended consequence. So in terms of policy, if that is a discussion down the road in terms of restrictions, we really need to think about those unintended consequences and making sure that certain cohorts of young people are not disadvantaged. Just the last point, it was mentioned a few times about existing regulation, the Digital Services Act, and I'll say this point with my researcher's hat on, that one of the aspects of the Digital Services Act is that vetted researchers can get access to actual use data from online platforms. So I reckon at best, the evidence we have in terms of research, we'd only know about 60% of how social media is impacting the health of teenagers. If we really want to get closer to 100%, we need that actual use data. But my colleagues who are trying to get access to this data under the Digital Services Act have told me that it's extremely difficult and complex to complicated to actually do it. So you mentioned that we have existing laws and regulations there. Well, they need to be enforced. If that data is to be made available to vetted researchers, well, that should be a very streamlined and easy process. And at present, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Great, Eoin. Thank you very much indeed. Time is running out, unfortunately, so we'll wrap up quickly. But I suppose the unintended consequence one is one that particularly struck me, and also maybe a number of you have touched on the extent to which maybe a populist decision or a populist preference for banning something, stopping something, just simply doesn't work. So that has come through very strongly from the discussion. Trina, have you any comments or reactions to what you just heard there?
No, I'll just add, unless it's decided by government, in which case it'll be a great idea. Just add this place. No, I think, the fast moving nature of it, of this whole area is a challenge. But in particular, I think it takes such a long period, not only to enact legislation, but to implement it by regulators. Commissioner Mann, after we had done the legislation, they then had to do their online safety code that gave some of the detail. But then there's a lot of JRs currently, judicial reviews currently around aspects of Commissioner Mann's work. So they proceed very carefully, and then they will go into investigations and so on. So it's the nature of politicians, I think, that if harms are still continuing, they'll feel, well, we must regulate, we must do something, we must find something else. We saw with the Data Protection Commission, it took, maybe people have forgotten now, it took several years of their work before they started coming to, grips with outcomes in terms of some of their decisions for online platforms. So it does take quite a period of time. That's no consolation to someone who has been affected, and of course politicians themselves are directly affected by a lot of online harm. So it's very personal, it's very visceral for them, and the concern is genuine. So I think it's balancing all those issues.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry that we've had to conclude at this point. As with the other two, we could have had a much lengthier discussion, but we're keen to move on. Thank you very much indeed to Trina, Ryan.